Enzo.com, Enzo.com, Enzo.com.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 24 of the Bobby Pickles podcast, podcasting from the Affinia Shelburne Hotel in the Murray Hill section of New York City. I'm Bobby Pickles. With me today is Peter Hochstein. Peter is a self-described jack-of-all-trades writer, part advertising copywriter, part business journalist, part hired gun author. His new book, HEIRESS, Strangled in Molten Chocolate at Nazi Sex Orgy, a memoir, is an historical account about his life growing up in Brooklyn with quote-unquote batshit crazy parents. Calling all gonzo journalists and the filthy swine who consume their yellow rhetoric, meet Peter Hochstein.
Hello, I'm Peter Hochstein. What's your name? Outstanding. Welcome to the Bobby Pickles podcast.
Bobby Pickles podcast. He always says, "That's me." With a look on his face, he'll talk about anything. Tattoos, t-shirts, politics, history, and hot sauce on everything. Bobby Pickles. Pop culture, documentaries, conspiracy theories, sarcasm, and beer. It's a conversation. Start listening, cause we're all here. Bobby Pickles podcast. That's me.
So, Peter Hochstein, here we are, a couple of crackerjack writers. Now, I've never won a Pulitzer or anything, but I can stream a few sentences together. Plus, I have a BA in English. So, I guess I feel like I could own that title too. But anyway, here the two of us are, held up at this Lexington Avenue Lodge. I always ask my guests to meet me somewhere either iconic or important to them in some way. Well, Peter, why here? Why the Affinia Shelburne Hotel?
Okay, in 1961, I was a reporter for the New York Post, which was then not a Murdoch newspaper. It was kind of a left-wing tabloid.
The New York Post is that's very Republican-leaning,
These
correct?
days. In those days, it was very liberal Democrat.
It was?
It changed owners. Yeah, it was owned by a woman named Dorothy Schiff. It was her toy, and she supported progressive causes. Her editor was a guy named James Wexler, who was a campaigning editor, if ever there was one, for progressive causes. She got tired. She sold the paper, first to some real estate mogul who nearly ran it into the ground. Then Rupert Murdoch came along and snapped it up, and poof, it was a right-wing paper, not a left-wing paper.
Does Rupert Murdoch own it to this day?
Yes, he does.
I didn't know
Part
that.
of News Corp, yep.
I had no idea.
Yep, all those tasteless headlines like headless body found in topless bar, that's under his administration.
How long have you worked for did you work for the New York Post?
Not very. I was a college student at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and they had a work and study program where you'd spend a few months working and then a few months studying. And I had managed to study a whole year in England, and thus when I came back to the States before I could graduate, I had to work for 9 months.
What did you major in?
English.
English, just like me?
Useless degree. Absolutely useless degree.
It is a useless degree. However, I feel like liberal arts degrees, you learn the most. Like, you learn such a vast array of all kinds of different general things. But, yes, you can't do anything with it. I mean, you have to basically figure it out for yourself. It's not like finance. If you major in finance, you're good, I feel like, especially in New York City.
Oh, in this town, yeah.
You can make your own, They make a fortune. But English degree, I agree with you.
Okay, so let me get back to the Shelburne Murray Hill, which is now the Affinia Shelburne Murray Hill. Back in 1960, there was a UN meeting, and it was like the ultimate summit conference. It was the Interplanetary Summit Conference. Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, was here when there was a Soviet Union. Fidel Castro was here. Marshal Tito of what was then Yugoslavia, there's no more Yugoslavia, he was here. And it was just diplomat city for several weeks. That was the year that Khrushchev at the UN didn't like something that was being said and took off his shoe and pounded it on the podium. Fidel Castro initially stayed here. Now, there was a kind of a problem with Castro in that he couldn't find a place to stay. No hotel wanted to take him. He had a very bad rep in the United States, which we had helped manufacture as Americans simply because he was a communist, although we may have pushed him into communism a little bit. But at any rate, he briefly stayed here at the Shelburne, and he got thrown out. I don't think they literally came and took him by the scruff of the neck and tossed him out, but they asked if he could find another place to stay, and the reason was that he was slaughtering chickens in his hotel room, plucking chickens in his hotel room, and cooking them. Now, this is not as crazy as it sounds.
Wait, who is this?
Fidel Castro.
Castro was doing this?
Yes, the head of Cuba.
This is when he came in 1960, for that tour that he came and did. It was after he had already taken over?
He had already taken over, and he was in New York just for the UN. And he was terrified of being poisoned by American agents. He had a point. At some point, the CIA had a plan to give him an exploding cigar. I mean, we were trying to off the guy, and we had already invaded. No, I'm wrong. We had not yet invaded Cuba. Mm-hmm. But anyway, he was staying here, and I was part of the crowd of press, and there were 7 newspapers in New York at the time, plus all kinds of radio stations.
You were covering the event?
Well, I was one of a zillion reporters covering the event. Yeah, there wasn't much to cover. What would happen is I couldn't be everywhere, and I was relatively lightweight at the time. They would have their regular UN correspondent at the UN, or the regular diplomatic correspondent at the UN. But where all the heads of state were staying, there'd be a little pack of press there reporting on what was called color. And I'll give you an example. One day I was outside the Russian embassy, which in those days was Park Avenue, 68th Street. Mm-hmm. And Nikita Khrushchev walks out. And all the press is literally penned in with police horses. And usually he would go straight to his limo, but this time he turned, gave us a broad smile, and tried to speak English. And the 2 words he spoke that he thought were English were "Gut Morgen." And so you'd get that. It would just be a little colorful something for the guy who was sitting in the city room writing the story while he was being fed details from people all over town.
So the Shelburne Hotel was like this place where all these diplomats and these important people...
Just the Cubans. Right up the block on the next corner.
And this is when Cuba and Russia were in bed together, right? They were supporting each other.
Yes.
Right? So did they take meetings together? Like, was Castro ever here when Khrushchev was here as well?
Khrushchev was staying at the Russian embassy, which is at Park Avenue and 68th Street. Some heads of state were staying at the Waldorf or at the Carlyle. Castro...
The Carlyle?
Yeah.
It's like the Carlyle group.
No.
Isn't there a... Okay.
No, it's just called the Carlyle Hotel. It's not part of the Carlyle group. It's up on Madison and I think it's 74th Street. Nice hotel. Mm-hmm. This hotel, this was before Affinia took it over, was kind of run down. It was a little bit down at the heels, but the Cuban embassy was just up the block, which was a good thing for Castro because he could speak to his diplomatic corps here. It was convenient, and they'd let him in, or they got persuaded to let him in. Mm-hmm. And the hotel at the time had no fear of losing major guests. In fact, if after this interview you walk up to the corner and cross the street, you'll see it's Lexington Avenue and 38th Street on 3 sides, and on the 4th side, the street sign says it's Hermanos al Rescate place or square or something. That's Spanish for Brothers to the Rescue, and that commemorates the invasion of Cuba by a group of Cuban exiles who thought they were going to take it back. That street corner was renamed under the Giuliani administration because Rudy Giuliani really had his own foreign policy.
Yeah.
And he sort of wanted to stick his finger in Castro's eye, and that's the way he did it.
Wow. So the Shelburne Hotel, right, was very, very close to all these different embassies. And it was an easy...
Well, there are some embassies nearby. It was also close to the UN building, which is just 8 blocks up on 42nd Street, and then you hang a right going east.
So you found yourself here a lot?
No, I found myself here 1 or 2 days. I found myself... This was just while this was happening. I found myself outside of the Russian embassy a few days. I found myself in the Yugoslav embassy one day. I found myself in Castro's girlfriend's apartment. I wish I could remember exactly where it was. Now, I was 20 years old. I was a young kid. This was an older woman for me, but she was a knockout.
Yeah.
Her name was Teresa Casuso. And she had been, I mean, the press was using the term mistress, but, you know, essentially she was his girlfriend. And at some point she decided that he was getting a little too tough and a little too dictatorial, and she sent him a Dear Fidel letter, which he actually read. And I remember sitting on the floor in her living room while we were asking her questions. I do not know what became of her. If she's alive now, she's about 90 years old. But as I said, one heck of a good-looking woman.
Drop dead gorgeous.
Oh, there were several of them.
Really?
The one, and you go back and you go on the internet and you look at pictures of these people. And the woman I'm going to talk about now, most of the pictures were taken of her that are on the internet, were taken of her well past her prime. But when I met her, she was only 30-something years old. She was a redhead. She was sometimes a redhead and sometimes a blonde. And she was gorgeous. Her name was Liz Renee. And she was a stripper. And she was the girlfriend of the gangster Mickey Cohn, who was the mafia's financial guy in Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
Mickey had also evidently offed a few people somewhere along the line, and the feds were after him. And they really couldn't get much on him. He was pretty slippery until the very end. He ended up in Alcatraz when there were still people in Alcatraz.
Really?
Yeah. He was one of the last prisoners in Alcatraz. But before that, all the feds could do was make his life miserable by busting his girlfriends, most of whom were strippers. So there was one named Candy Barr, and she got found somehow or other with a huge bag full of marijuana and ended up doing time. And then Liz Renee, they couldn't plant marijuana on her, but she did 3 years for something or other. And she had just gotten out of prison. Mickey was still in prison. And they had an apartment in Manhattan. And she came back, she said, to retrieve some poetry that they had written together and some paintings. All I remember is I'm standing on the street, and this woman, she was wearing heels, but she was tall. I remember the red hair. I remember the strong, high cheekbones, and fantastic figure. And she was wearing a black coat, which was a combination of lace and satin over a black sheath dress, and I'm falling in love with her. And I did ask, this is in the book, which is, again, Heiress, Strangled, and Molten Chocolate at Nazi Sex Orgy, a memoir, available on the internet. I did ask her if she would read some of her poetry. She said, I don't have it with me, but I'll recite a sample. And I remember only one quatrain of it. It was a bitter battle, but I have won. Your forces are routed, you are undone. And the thought that I loved was, here is this gangster and this stripper, both from Vegas, essentially, sitting in this little hideaway apartment in New York, writing poetry.
How did you get to interview her?
She had made a press event out of it. In those days, there was something called the AP Local Wire. It doesn't exist anymore. But there were 7 daily newspapers in New York at the time. And that
doesn't exist anymore, the AP?
No, the AP exists.
I mean, we get
the AP New York local.
I was saying, like, how I worked at WMNF in Tampa. We would always receive the AP news stuff.
Oh, yeah.
In the morning.
There's
or whatever, all day.
The AP is very much with us, but they had a little sub-business called the New York Local Wire, the AP Local Wire in New York.
Just for local NYC stuff?
Yeah. Remember, there were a whole bunch of radio stations covering news. There were 3 television stations. There were 7 newspapers. AP would sometimes double cover us, would sometimes find out that things were happening, and you'd get a call from the city editor saying, get up to whatever the street corner is. Liz Renee is outside her apartment. Interview her. And you'd get there, and there'd be like 20 guys with pads, pencils, flash guns. I don't know if you're not even old enough to remember flash guns.
No, what is a flash gun?
Well, they used to have these big press cameras. You had to hold it with 2 hands. And there would be a long pole attached to it with 4 D-sized batteries. And you would screw what was called the flash bulb into a reflector. And when you took the picture, it would make a sort of a popping sound, and the bulb would be burned out. You'd throw the bulb away, and then they'd get another bulb. There was none of this rapid-fire shooting yet.
God, stuff is so much different now,
yeah.
right?
Strobes were just coming in. I worked with one photographer who had a strobe, but he was kind of cutting edge.
How long was your career as a newspaper man?
Damn short.
It was?
Yeah, it started before the New York Post. Here's the story. I wanted to be a writer on the basis of something my mother believed, which I absorbed because I was a very naive young kid. I believed that all writers made $1 bazillion. And
where did you get that silly idea?
From my mother, who was crazy.
Batshit crazy, right?
Oh, not. I'll tell you about that.
Okay, yeah, I know. We'll get to that.
But she believed that if you had a book published, you must have made $1 million. And I kept hearing, this is a good book, he must have made $1 million. That's a good book, he made $1 million. So I figured I would make $1 million by going and writing a book or becoming an author. And I looked around for, this is all in the memoir, by the way. I looked around for where I could learn writing that I could get into, because I had been a kind of mediocre high school student. And there was Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. At the time, 2 professors in the literature department, as it was called, Nolan Miller and Judd Jerome, both have gone on to that great literary salon in the sky. These guys were putting out an annual paperback book called New Campus Writing, featuring all the hotshot young writers who were on the college campuses at the time. And they were teaching creative writing. So I said, that's where I want to go. It was one of the reasons I wanted to go there. And I arrived at campus and took my freshman English course, and I'm ready to take creative writing, and I look in the catalog, and poof, it's gone. Nolan and Judd had gotten together and said, you really can't teach this stuff.
What?
Yep. And they stopped teaching it. It came back. Later on, they resumed. But for about 3 or 4 years, they had stopped teaching it. So I'd come to write, and I had been baited and switched. I didn't know what to do. And I looked around for who was writing, and in the basement at the time, the main building, and then later on in the Student Union building, when the Student Union building got built, they had the Antioch College Record, the student weekly newspaper. And these were guys, some of them who had gone out and had newspaper jobs, and women too. And they wanted to be newspaper reporters, and they were putting out a newspaper, and I started writing for them. And I got the bug, and it bit me really badly.
How old were you when you realized you were a writer?
It was well before college. I was about 14.
Right. I think I was like in 4th grade. I remember the time when we had a little, the teacher made everybody write a poem, and I wrote it, and then read it out, and she was like, wow, that was really good. And I realized right then that I was a writer and I could write. Did you have that same kind of thing? It was 14, that's a little older.
There was kind of an epiphany. I was a bright kid with a severe case of attention deficit disorder, although it didn't have a name at the time. But my mother would yell at me. She'd say, I went to school on open school day, and all the kids were looking up and raising their hands, and you're staring out the window. Yes, I was. That's the old ADD kicking in. It still kicks in to this very day.
Yeah.
I had done well enough, but not fabulously well at everything except math, which I couldn't do at all.
Oh, my God, I'm the worst at math. Yeah. I know nothing about math. I am so bad. It's like, actually, it's sad. It's very sad. I have just the English brain, side of it.
Yeah, that was me. But we were assigned to write an essay on how to make something in the 9th grade. And I wrote an essay, I still remember the title, The Proper Method and Procedure of Shrinking the Human Head. And everybody got all excited, did just what you did, and laughed. And suddenly I had done something in school that got a positive reaction as opposed to no reaction or, oh, my God, this kid's going to flunk math.
See, that's what it is for everybody. You know, the first time you read it, and then all of a sudden you get a positive reinforcement right there, and then you know you're on the right track, and that's like the kind of thing that you're made for, you know?
Yeah.
But, yeah, I had the same kind of experience. But it happened a little earlier than that, than 14.
At any rate, I go to work trying to be a newspaper man in a college that doesn't teach journalism either. And
that's so crazy. So it has journalism?
It didn't have, but there were lots of people who wanted to be journalists. Remember, they had this work and study program. So every so often, someone would go out and work for a weekly newspaper or work. I had a friend who worked for the Troy, Ohio Daily News, which is about as small a town as you can have and still have a daily. The Troy Daily News is still there.
It is?
I noticed. It's not the paper it used to be when the guy I worked for was editing it. And what happened was somebody had gotten one of these co-op on again, off again, 3 months on, 3 months off jobs. But they were beginning to put out a Sunday newspaper, and she said, Glenn, who was her boss, the editor, Glenn needs reporters to put out a Sunday edition. And that was it. I was, got in the car, I had a little jalopy, and I drove, I think it was about 25 miles from Yellow Springs to Troy, Ohio, presented myself on a Saturday morning, and for something like 10 Saturdays in a row, worked from 2 o'clock in the afternoon, driving up after my last class, until about 4 o'clock Sunday morning, putting out the Sunday edition of the Troy Daily News, for which I was paid whatever Glenn happened to have in his cash box. Some days it was $25. Some days it was $14. Once it was $4.66. Didn't matter. I was just getting off on it.
Right.
And he also taught me my first journalism lesson.
What was that?
Well, we got a police call that there was an accident involving an automobile and a house. And this was farm country. It was winter, and I drove maybe 15 miles from Troy, and there on some back road, I come to a farm, and sure enough, an Oldsmobile, remember Oldsmobiles? An Oldsmobile has jumped the ditch, torn through a barbed wire fence, ripped up about 150 feet of cornfield, hit a house, and gone through it. And I went to the house. The cops were there. The driver was a 10-year-old boy who had wanted to drive his father's car to see what it was like.
Hey, we're out on a farm. That's normal, right? Don't they learn to...
I don't know, but...
I think they learned to drive very
out of control.
young.
No, this wasn't his father's farm. What had happened was he went for a drive down the road, doing what he'd seen his father do. And he was a little kid, and he fell off the seat and fell onto the accelerator pedal. The car just had a life of its own. As I said, jumped the ditch, tore up the cornfield, crashed into the house, and ended up with the front wheels literally in the farmer's bed.
Wow.
Now, it happened that the farmer and his wife had been watching television in their bedroom, but there was a commercial break, and they got up to get milk and cookies. This is 10 o'clock at night, somewhere near Troy, Ohio. They had gotten up to get milk and cookies in the kitchen, and while they were pouring the milk, they heard this crash, and they ran back to their bedroom. There was an Oldsmobile in their bed with a 10-year-old boy crawling out, who amazingly was bruised a little bit, was not hurt. Now, I had learned from a very bad journalism textbook what was called the inverted pyramid story.
That's right. I know the inverted pyramid.
Yeah.
So you could read one sentence and you already got the whole thing, and as you go down, it gets more narrow.
Yeah, and gives more and more details. So I came back to the office and I wrote, James Brown, 10 years old, stole his father's car, lost control, ripped across 150 feet of cornfield, crashed into the... And my editor, Glenn, was saying, feed me the pages as you have them. And he gets the first page and he screams. He says, what the hell do you think this is? I said, what are you talking about? He says, that's not the way you write this story. Let me show you how to write a story. Now, the one thing you need to know, of course, nobody alive remembers anymore, but there was a race car driver once upon a time named Barney Oldfield.
Okay.
And he writes the first sentence, the lead sentence of the story, and instead of who, what, when, where, and how, it said, a 10-year-old boy was all shook up but unhurt last night after a wild ride that would have made the late Barney Oldfield look like a piker.
That's a really
and
good
he
sentence.
threw the story back to me. He sat in kind of a slot with a giant moon-shaped desk surrounding him. We sat on the outer rim. He threw it back across the room. He said, here, now you finish it. So that was my first writing lesson.
That was a great hook, right?
Yeah.
And that's where you learned it.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the book a little bit, because I'd like to get into that. The way that you titled your book. Say the title of the book again.
HEIRESS strangled in molten chocolate at Nazi sex orgy. A memoir.
A memoir. And it's all in capital letters.
Yeah, because it's like a tabloid newspaper.
Like a tabloid newspaper.
Now, there's a reason for the title, and it goes back to that same stupid journalism textbook. Since there was nobody to teach us journalism, people were learning it out of books. And in the college newspaper office, I found stuffed into a desk drawer some paperback textbook. And I remember reading it. That's where I learned about inverted pyramids, which were just beginning to pretty much go out of style unless you work for the AP. But it also said that there are certain subjects. One of the chapters talked about what stories do you put on the front page. And it said certain subjects are more powerful than others and will get the most readership. And it listed the subjects. And they were sex, money, violence, food, and Nazis. And I said, boy,
so you put all of it together.
I said, if I could ever have a story that had sex, violence, food, money, and Nazis all in one story, it would be the most powerful newspaper story ever written. And no matter how many times I've tried to put together the headline, it always came out something like HEIRESS strangled in molten chocolate at Nazi sex orgy. And I've been looking for that story that would make me rich and famous my entire life, and I got to tell you, it's been a spectacular waste of time.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. What I do, though, is at the very last chapter of the book, I finally broke down and wrote the story. Actually, I made it up. And I learned about making up stories largely after I was on the Post. I had one more job. What had happened, I spent 9 months on the Post, and if the Post kept me on staff more than one more day, the New York Newspaper Guild would have said, you now own him. because typically what they would do is let you try out for 3 months before you had to hire somebody or not. They let me go for 9 months. I was evidently, after a bad start, I was doing very well, or well enough at any rate. But
you kept on getting better, and they kept you on for longer.
Until the 9 months were up. And I went back to college for 2 terms to graduate. When I came back, they said, Pete, we can't take you again. We'll never be able to get rid of you. But one of the editors called me a couple of days later and said, there's a guy named Bob Harrison. Go see him. He's looking to hire a reporter. Now, I had no idea who Bob Harrison was. But it turned out that he was kind of the father of the sleazy publishing business.
Okay. What do you mean, sleazy publishing business?
I mean,
not
gossip rag.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The kind of
tabloids.
Well, no, but not the tabloids. I mean, the New York Post, even in its current incarnation, is a charm school graduate compared to the kind of stuff he was doing. He had hookers out in Los Angeles tattling on stars for him. But when he didn't have it, he would sort of bend the truth, twist the truth, or just strangle it. And I went up to see him in his apartment. He had an apartment on the same block. It's gone now. It was in a hotel called the Madison Hotel. His apartment was on one side of the block, and on the other side was his office. That whole block was torn down and replaced by the General Motors building. Okay, and he had a spectacular apartment. It had a balcony. It was a duplex, but with a cathedral ceiling in the living room and a balcony with all the bedrooms opening up on the balcony. And I was ushered in by one of his sisters. He had 2 sisters who were in their 50s. Remember, I was only, at this point, 22.
Were they attractive?
Yeah, they were very attractive. They really were. They were good looking.
There's a theme going on here. There's always the attractive.
I like good-looking women.
Me too.
And she said, sit down, Bob will be out in a minute. And suddenly a door flies open up on the balcony, and Bob comes out and there's this huge mane of gray hair, and he's wearing a paisley silk bathrobe with a mink collar on it. And he says, did Reggie call again? And the sister says, yeah, she keeps calling. He says, tell her I'm not here. Evidently, he was dumping one girlfriend, and he had already taken up with another. And the girlfriend who had been dumped wasn't having it, so she was pursuing him. And finally, he got dressed, and he came down, and he said, who the hell are you? And I said, well, I called. You were looking for a newspaper reporter. And he says, newspaper reporter? He says, I can't use newspaper reporters. They don't know what news is. I said, Bob, what are you talking about? He said, look, let me give you a test. I'll give you a headline. He started to write it out in the air or trace it with his fingers as he recited. Movie star gets drunk, gets into sports car, kills 6 people. Is that news? I said, of course it's news. He says, that's not news. Anybody can get drunk and get into a sports car and kill 6 people. I said, what's news? He says, famous movie star gets drunk on water, gets into car, kills 6 people. That's news. I said, Bob, how do you get news like that? He said, there's only one way, kid. You got to make it up.
This guy, Bob, sounds like a gem.
Oh, yeah. Actually, there was a sketch about him written by Tom Wolfe, the journalist and novelist.
The acid test, right?
I'm not sure whether it was the acid test or the orange candy Kool-Aid, something or other.
Yeah, the Kool-Aid, exactly, yeah.
But it's a chapter in the book called The Esthétique du Schlock. And he had Bob down perfect.
I have that book home. I'm going to check this out when I get home.
So you're going to look for The Esthétique du Schlock.
Okay.
Bob had this magazine Confidential for years and years, and finally all the irate subjects of his journalism had sued him out of business. He sold the title to a now no longer existing publishing company called Fawcett, and he began investing in the stock market, and evidently it hit a downturn, and he lost $75,000, which he told me about. It's 4 or 5 times. $75,000 was a lot of money in those
in 1960 what?
1962.
1962.
Yeah, I was probably multiplied by 10 or 12. It was close to losing $1 million, and he felt he had to start working again. So he was going to put out a new rag called Inside News, and I was going to help him do it. The next day, I went around the corner to his office, and he was there, and the 2 sisters were there, amazingly. They followed him everywhere. They doted on him. They had been married. One had been divorced. They were devoting their whole life to taking care of Bob, their brother Bob. And there was also a guy, I wish I could remember his name, I remember he was wearing a blue blazer, and in those days everybody wore neckties to work, even if you were a reporter. A blue blazer and a red striped shirt with a red tie, and I looked at the guy, and I didn't know what it was yet, although in retrospect, with a little more experience under my belt, I could see it was jaundice. I mean,
jaundice? What is that again?
Well, it's a liver disease caused by cirrhosis of the liver. The guy was
a drinker.
Yeah, and he had his hand had a tremor, but he was a writer who Bob had flown in from.
So he would get the shakes in the morning before he got a sip of alcohol?
I think he was dry for the moment. But he was none too clean. There was dirt under his fingernails. If you looked at his cuffs, his shirt cuffs were black. And he said he was sleeping on a table in a friend's darkroom.
Wow.
And he'd worked for Bob before, and Bob had brought him in. And the way the system worked is we would sit around and we'd kick around ideas as if you were working in an ad agency, and I've done that too. And Bob would pull things out of the newspaper. He envied Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell was a syndicated columnist and also had a radio show. Mm-hmm. And he imagined himself Walter Winchell's rival. Winchell would have nothing to do with him. In fact, he would take us all to lunch. And
how did you get the job, though? So you went there, you met him, he came out, he was scribbling it in the sky, he was telling you how to make it, and he hired you right on the spot?
I said I'd been reported for the Post. He said, I'm looking for a good writer. And I said, okay, I'm a good writer.
So this is like the first foray into fiction, really?
Yeah, if you want to put it that way. So I gave him an idea the first day out. I had just been in the Army. I'd done 6 months. In those days, you could spend 6 months in the Army and then join the reserves. And we had been seeing...
So you got out of college, and then you went into the Army?
No, I got out of college. I wrote books for a while, and then I went into the Army. And then, I was a busy boy. This all happened between 61 and 62, 63. I got out of college. There's a newspaper strike on. Newspapers are folding left and right. The New York Herald Tribune vanished after that strike. The New York Daily Mirror vanished after that strike. The New York Journal American vanished after that strike. Briefly, they combined into something called the World Journal Tribune, which I don't remember how long it lasted. It was hardly enough time to sneeze, and then it was gone.
There were so many local New York City newspapers back then.
Yeah,
wow.
It was a different kind of business.
It was, right?
Yeah, and they were all rich with staff. I mean, the Daily News had 10 guys driving around town with radio cars chasing police stories. Photographer and reporter just driving around finding the next, because they like crime pictures a lot. And those were the days when newspaper pictures mattered a lot, because television was kind of black and white and grainy and full of snow and didn't look all that great. And the internet, there were no computers. I mean, except for
typewriters.
Typewriters. So anyway, I said, I got an idea, Bob. I said, how do you like Fidel Castro's all-girl firing squads? He said, what's that? I said, well, we were in the Army, and we saw films of people being shot by his firing squads, and you want a twist. Suppose they're all girlfriend, which has a little sexy something to it. I don't know what. And he says, I don't like it, but write it.
This guy's awesome. I love him.
Yeah. He would put you down no matter what you did. And so I wrote the story about this guy being dragged and tied to a pole, and all these women in fatigues raised their rifles, bang, bang, bang. And he says, you call this writing? And I pushed it through the typewriter 2 or 3 times. Now, what's interesting is that he never read the story. One of the sisters would read it in a monotone that could put you to sleep. I have another friend who briefly worked for Harrison, trying to help him put out a book, now a very well-known mystery author named Lawrence Block. And Larry is a college friend of mine. And Larry said he's always been convinced that the reason the sisters were reading the stories aloud was that Bob was an illiterate.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah, but they would read this aloud in a monotone, which could make anything sound boring. And he'd say, nah, this isn't very good. So he put me down. 2 days later, the editor, while Bob was out of the office, said he really loved that story. I said, what do you mean he loved the story? He told me it was shit. And he said, oh, no. He said, in fact, he went up to Central Park. He hired a bunch of models to dress up in fatigues. He got some BB guns. He had himself tied to a tree. And I remember seeing the picture in the newspaper. There he is wearing his double-breasted suit tied to a tree with 3 very, very husky-looking women pointing pop guns at him or something.
That is so funny.
Bob was a huge ham. He loved stuff like that. So he loved that. I did another story called The Village of Bald Women. This is when women the big style was to wear wigs, and women would change their wigs a lot. And human hair wigs were the best. So I invented this little impoverished town where the women were forcibly having their heads shaved to make
wigs.
To make wigs for all you guilt-ridden readers out there. And I made up a story which ended up with the headline, Call Boy Brothel Raided. The notion was, because this was one of my college fantasies, that there are all these college kids working in a whorehouse for rich women. And these rich, gorgeous women, what the hell would a rich, gorgeous woman need with a college? But would come in and pay them to have sex with them. I love that. And then one day, Bob had kept all the mechanicals, which is the way you put together layouts before computers.
What was it called?
A mechanical essentially was a piece of foam board to certain dimensions on which the type was pasted and the photographs were pasted. And then that would be photographed and that would be engraved and that would become your photo offset. And he did a story about making guns out of cigarette lighters. The fifth day he came into the office all excited. There had been a big story in all the legitimate newspapers. The niece, to this day, I hate to mention her name because she still might be alive, but the niece of a very famous movie actor had a lover, a Swiss lover. She was only 14 or 15 years old, and he jilted her. And she did what, this handsome, worldly guy, and he sleeps with her, and then he dumps her and goes down to Brazil. And evidently there was another girlfriend down there. There was some cryptic paragraph in Winchell's column that to me was unintelligible. Bob reads that and he says, oh, that's why she disappeared, because she had disappeared for about 5 days before she reappeared in New York, or Connecticut, I think it was. Bob said, oh, that's why. She cut off his privates to throw in the face of her rival. I said, Bob, I don't read this anywhere. He says, Winchell said it. It's true. I said, I don't see Winchell saying that. He says, write it. I said, look, Bob, I don't mind making up stories about make-believe people. I don't mind making up stories about make-believe events. But I draw the line about making up stories about real people. This is not... He said, I never liked you in the first place. Get out of here, you're fired.
Wow.
So on my fifth day working for him, I was out on my butt.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm absolutely serious.
5 days.
5 days. I got my week's pay, which was, are you ready for this? $70, which was kind of cheesy even then. I mean, you could live on about 100 or 125 a week in those days, but $70 or $70, no way.
So this is just like a National Enquirer kind of.
Yeah, only much more National Enquiry than the
this is absolute. When I
National Enquirer was inspired by.
So when I was talking before, I mean, I did that blind. When I said the whole thing about yellow journalism, it was just kind of joking and being satirical, but it was absolutely true in your regard, right? You had the experience with yellow journalism, and that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
So, okay, you do a stint in the Army, you go to college, you get your degree in English, correct, from Antioch?
No, I had my degree in English before I'm in the Army. I graduated from college in 61.
You worked at the Post?
I worked at the Post in 1960, in the very beginning of 61. I graduated in June 61, having gone back to, I finished the Post at 60. In January of 61, I go back to Antioch. I spent January through the beginning of June finishing up my degree. I graduate. I come back. There's nothing for me on the Post. My pal Larry Block, Lawrence Block, got me into writing dirty books. That's another story. By today's standards, they were not very dirty. I mean, I think my books would have blushed if they read 50 Shades of Grey.
But
at the time, that was considered really pornographic stuff. I mean, there'd be mention of breasts and thighs, and no sex organs. And all of a sudden, everything would turn to stars and smoke because you didn't get too specific.
How long did you do that for?
I did it for 6 months until I went in the Army. And then I came out of the Army, and I tried again to get on the Post, and it wasn't working, largely because all these newspapers had imploded just as I got back. And I worked for Harrison for a week.
And then now, where did you go from there?
Well, I went first to a, thank goodness, finished publicity. They're going to a canned publicity feature place called Central Feature News, where we would work in generous plugs for various products.
So it's an advertorial.
Yeah, that's essentially what it was. And these things were distributed free.
You've written all kinds of shit.
No kidding. And I think you call it by the right name, too.
Well, that's funny, but it's just all kinds of different kinds of writing, right?
Yep.
A whole...
Yeah. Well, to tell you the truth, in the very end of 1963, I got my first job in advertising. And the advertising...
And this is where everything changes. You become a copywriter,
I become an advertising...
Now, this is during the Mad Men days, too, right?
Yes.
Oh, my God. Were you on Madison Avenue?
Yeah, well, just off it. I was at Ogilvy in May.
You were at Ogilvy?
I was there 3 times. I was in.
How long did you work at Ogilvy for?
A total of 26 years, but it was spread over something like 30.
You've met Ogilvy before?
Oh, he taught my freshman copywriting class there.
Oh, my God. When did you take... your freshman, the first year that you were there.
Yeah.
So you didn't have any ad writing...
None at all. And I had applied to other agencies, and they said, write us a couple of sample ads. And I didn't know what they were, and I had no sense of advertising, and they wouldn't hire me. But I wrote to David Ogilvy, and I said I'd been a newspaper reporter. I sent him some of my clips. And his agency at the time was known as the Long Copy Agency. Long headlines at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in your news Rolls Royce is the ticking of the electric clock.
That's right. I've seen some Ogilvy ads, some of those old school ones where it's really long.
Yeah.
A lot of copy there.
Yeah, and they figured that somebody who could write something as long as a newspaper article. I didn't tell them about the books.
Totally different kind of advertising back then, right?
Yeah.
The heyday of advertising.
Yeah. And, in fact, the first 2 years, I really wasn't aware of stuff going on, but I left Ogilvy the first of 3 times and went to an agency called Benton and Bowles. And that really was one of those Mad Men kind of shops. Mm-hmm. And I worked for a guy who, most of the copywriters were guys. You know, we had one woman in the group. If she wasn't there, we'd be sitting around in the afternoon, and he'd say something like, hey, it's 2 o'clock, I don't feel like working anymore. Who wants to go out and get laid? And there were a couple of guys who were married and not very comfortable with this, to tell you the truth. But I was young and single and 24, 25. My hand shot up, and he had a collection of people who were available. So, I mean, I loved working for the guy. There were some prices to pay. I had a large studio apartment on the 17th floor at 15th Street and 3rd Avenue with a view till forever, for which I was paying $150 a month. Money was different then.
I'm putting it in perspective, because you said you made 70 a week, you said, right?
Well, when I went...
At that other place a couple years before.
Then when I jumped to Ogilvy, I started at $150 a week, which I think was like $7,000 and change a year. And when I went to Benton and Bowles, I was making $11,000 a year. That was major bucks.
Which transfers into like that what now?
It's pretty hard to figure, but my guess is something like 80 or 90.
Wow.
And, you know, I mean, that was when Playboy was running articles, you know, are you Playboy material? And it says, do you intend to make $10,000 a year by the time you're 30? I was in my mid-20s. I was making $11,500. I mean, hey, you know, hot stuff. So, at any rate, there were guys in the agency who were having affairs. And one day my boss said, I'm taking you out to lunch. And he says, you're spending lunch hour with me. I need the key to your apartment. I said, what do you mean you need the key? He says, I need the key to your apartment. And I need you to write a note saying, Mr. and Mrs. It was a made-up name. I'll be using my apartment to freshen up. And it was like the apartment, like the Jack Lemmon movie. So I said, okay, just this once. And I came back. My apartment was very neat. The bed had been straightened out. There was 3/4 of a bottle of Haig & Haig Pinch Scotch whiskey left for me. They had taken a little off the top and left the rest for me. And I was fine till the following week when it happened again. This kept happening. I never found out who it was. My boss was very discreet. I would ask him today, but he's dead now. So it's
wow. How long did you stay in the ad world for?
Well, it's a young person's business, and you're generally, unless you're very, very, very senior, you're washed up by age 50. I lasted till 55, which would put us back in 1995. And then I had a good reputation, so I started working from home just doing freelance, and I got a couple of clients.
And you still do freelance?
Yeah, a much lower level.
But you do direct marketing freelance, correct?
Yeah, well...
direct marketing ads.
Yeah, I'm not going to bore you with this because it is boring.
I find it fascinating.
At some point I drifted from general advertising and doing big-time television commercials to direct response where you could actually put out an ad and see what the results were.
Yes.
I mean,
you could gauge your
know
response
what-
instantly.
yeah. I mean, we had a lot of fun out in California. I was one of the people involved in the Merrill Lynch Bulls commercials when they had a herd of bulls running up the Gaviota Beach in California, and Kevin McCarthy, who was an actor at the time, voiceover was saying, "America, Merrill Lynch is bullish on America." This was during a recession. "We believe we have the strength to weather our hard times and come back even stronger." Just then the herd of bulls would run over the camera and kick sand into the ledge. It was great stuff.
I'm actually interested in ad writing and stuff. However, it's so hard to get your foot in the door.
It was hard then. I imagine it's harder now.
It's very hard
It's
because
one
you
of
have
those
to.
things that you can't do until they won't let you do it until
You've already done it, and you have to work for free, basically, right? But I have my spec book together and actually took some classes at NYU in copywriting. And you didn't, by any chance, have you ever ran into a Frank Murphy?
No, except for an occasional.
He's probably
gig
around your age, I would imagine.
No, except for an occasional gig in ad agencies. I haven't set foot in an agency in about 10 years.
Right, since '95.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are 2 or 3 cases where I got called into small agencies on a project. But I was already older than the oldest guy there, old enough to be the father of the oldest guy there.
Did you enjoy ad writing more than journalism?
No. I had an evil Aunt Sylvia who pressured me out of the newspaper business and into the advertising business.
You had a what? An evil aunt?
Evil aunt. Her name was Sylvia.
Okay.
She lived to 92 because she was too mean to die.
Why was she evil?
I have...
Why is everybody in your family evil or
she-
batshit crazy or
She
something?
was a liar. She was a backstabber. She insisted on taking over the life of anybody she was with.
You did not inherit any of these traits or
I
genes?
certainly didn't inherit any of her money. My cousins did, but I didn't get a nick. My brother did.
No, I mean the genes that,
No,
traits, character traits. No.
She was a strange duck. I was having lunch with an Ogilvy colleague maybe 30 years ago at the Oyster Bar at Grand Central Station. And he said he had been at Y&R where my evil Aunt Sylvia had worked. And I said, "Oh, I have an aunt who worked there." And he said, "What's her name?" And I said, "Sylvia Simmons." And he got up and left the restaurant. Now, he came back. He came back. But, I said, "You don't have to apologize. I feel the same way." When my brother and I had bought an apartment for my mother, and it's a long story, but she ended up owning half the apartment instead of my brother. I owned the other half. And when my mother died, she was essentially impoverished except for this very expensive apartment. And the day my mother dies, Sylvia calls me up and she says, "You better do exactly what I tell you to do because you're not going to be able to make a move without me." But my mother just died. While my mother was dying, my aunt would call me at work. I was still on my last job. This is 1994. And she would say, "I want you to call this doctor and tell him this, that, and the other thing, and tell him they're doing that wrong and this wrong." I said, "Why don't you tell him?" She said, "You do it." It turned out that she had been such a pain in the butt telling him how to practice medicine that he was no longer taking her calls.
Obviously. So then making you go and do it now.
And
Going
at one
through you.
point, we were both in the hospital, and they were wheeling my mother somewhere. They'd taken a couple of blood samples. And she literally grabs the intern, pins him up against the wall, and says, "Wait a second. Why did you take 2 tubes of blood?" He says, "Because they go to 2 different labs." She says, "Oh," walked over. She was an impossible human being.
Yeah, she was just a control freak, right?
Yeah. And she controlled most of the family.
What did she
very
do
well.
in the ad agency?
Well, she started out as a copywriter, but when she got to Y&R, she found a great berth for herself. Somehow she worked herself into a position where she was writing speeches for the chairman. I'd seen some of her advertising work. I don't think it was that good, that original. It's kind of tired, but she could write a good speech.
I love speech writing.
And
I
so-
love writing rhetoric and stuff. Antithesis. I love it. That's an awesome.
So she had a little niche that nobody else wanted or could wrest her away from her anyway. She had a direct line to the chairman of the board, and that's the way it stayed.
And she stayed there for forever. She retired from
she
Y&R?
No, at one point I think the chairman retired, and she attached herself to a creative director named Steve Frankfurt, who went to another agency, the name of which is escaping me at the moment. She spent a year there and then retired.
So you were always in the creatives, right? But then they had this whole other section. They had the account people, right?
Yeah.
Talk to me about that for a second. I mean, do you have any stories regarding like the account people and the creatives? I know they had a weird relationship between them.
Well,
nobody was like the boss, and
well, a lot of those guys were good friends of mine. Yeah, typically there's a wall, essentially the business side and the creative side.
right.
And the business guys have a tendency to want to sell the client what he wants to buy because they're responsible for keeping this business.
Mm-hmm.
The creatives need to pad their portfolios and their reels, and so they want breakthrough crazy stuff that sometimes scares the client. So there's sometimes some friction. But I never got involved with that.
Are you a lifelong New Yorker?
Well, except for 9 years that I spent in the suburbs in Port Washington, New York. This was back in 1970.
Port Washington? Where's that? That's out on Long Island?
Shore of Long Island, yep.
That's where the ferry is, right?
No, that's Port Jefferson.
Port Jefferson,
That's
right.
further out. Port Washington's not that far. But I could have a backyard. I don't remember why, but at the time, this is during the
Commuting
whole
into the city during the ad agencies? When you were...
yeah. Remember, this is during the whole back to the soil movement and the commune movement. And for some reason, it was extremely important to me that I grow my own tomatoes. So I grew my own tomatoes. Also discovered I was not meant to live in a wooden house that I own.
Why?
Well, bad things happen to wooden houses. The
Termites?
Termites, wet rot, dry rot, flooded basement, rotten roof. I mean, at one point, I came out of my house on the way to the railroad station. I happened to turn around and noticed white smoke coming from the chimney. I said, wait a second, I didn't elect the Pope.
I was going to just say that.
What had happened was that the boiler had burst and was dumping water on the fire, which was then turning into steam and was going on. I went into the basement and I had 2 feet of water in the basement. I hated living in the suburbs, but I somehow wanted the backyard, and I liked being 2 blocks from the water.
What borough did you grow up in?
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn?
I grew up
Where in Brooklyn?
I grew up in Flatbush Avenue. For those Brooklynites listening in, I was the corner of Albemarle Road and East 21st Street. That's Albemarle between Flatbush and East 21st. Went to Erasmus Hall High School. No, I was not in Barbara Streisand's class. She was 2 years behind me. I was in Lainey Kazan's class, though.
Who's that?
Lainey Kazan was a club singer, mostly in San Francisco and New York. She had the same kind of voice Streisand had, but Streisand eclipsed her. And she turned actress. You saw her in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. She played one of the mothers-in-law.
Okay.
Okay.
Barbara Streisand was in your high school? Wow.
Nobody knew her.
You don't remember seeing her or anything like that?
No, until I had a girlfriend who I reunited with after I got divorced, obviously, first. But for 7 years, I lived with a high school sweetheart who had been in Streisand's class, and nobody knew her. And I took out the yearbook for that year. And there's a picture of Streisand. They would list all the clubs you had been in underneath. And the only club for Streisand was the Glee Club. Chorus, I think. Chorus. She was in Chorus.
You don't have any more of your high school yearbooks?
I have mine, but I don't have the one that Streisand is.
But she wasn't in it.
She was my girlfriend.
How many times have you been married? Have you been married more than once?
I've been married once. I lived with the love of my life for 7 years, and unfortunately,
That was her?
2.5 years ago, she died. She fell down a flight of stairs.
Are you
hit her
serious?
head. Yeah, absolutely. Everything is fairly common. You then start hearing, everybody knows of somebody who fell down the stairs. Fell down the stairs, hit her head, had an internal hemorrhage. We got her immediately to New York Hospital, and they have a neuro ICU there. But they couldn't stop the bleeding, and she essentially
I'm sorry.
in her own brain after. Yeah. I still find myself 2.5 years later talking to her sometimes. It's kind of painful, but I'm pretty much past it. And she would not have wanted me to sit there mourning.
When did you get married for the first time?
I got married in 1968.
Kids?
One kid who is a newspaper editor now.
He is?
Yeah, he's
Where's he at? New York?
American Banker. He's executive editor of American Banker.
He does all financial stuff, huh?
Yeah. And he's very good at it. He's very funny.
He is?
Yeah.
Did he inherit somehow the financial side of the brain?
I don't want to.
We don't have to talk
credit
about
myself.
it too.
No, I don't want to credit myself. I mean, he's pretty much done it on his own. He was a much better student than I was. He went to Johns Hopkins, which was a much better college than the one I went to. He's had a much more focused career, and he's doing very well, and I'm very proud of him.
But he's a chip off the own block when it comes to...
No, I think he's really his own block. He's his own person. How did we get off on the...
Well, I was just talking to you a little bit about your background and stuff like that, and how long you got married and things like that. You said 1968 you got married.
And in 1993, my wife of, at that point, 25 years, forgot to come home. I'm giving you the short end of the story, not the whole thing. And we then ended up suing each other for 4.5 years for divorce, and it finally ended. And it's one of those things where the only person who came away with real money were the lawyers. But I haven't spoken to her since. She hasn't spoken to me since. And she's leading her own life, and I'm leading mine. Then I kind of was on my own for 7 years, and then I met the late Roberta.
Who was the love of your life?
Was the love of my life. And she was gorgeous. She was brilliant. She had become quite a success. She was a Park Avenue psychiatrist with a celebrity clientele.
Oh, my God, I'd imagine.
She was making a ton of money. And
then that tragic thing happened.
And that tragic thing happens. And it was Thanksgiving night. We had her grandkids over, and her apartment was a duplex.
Thanksgiving night?
Thanksgiving night. We had borrowed her grandchildren to give her daughter and son-in-law
a night out in the town or whatever.
Really, because she wanted to be with the grandkids. We were upstairs playing some board game with them, Candyland or something. And Roberta said, I'm just going down for a Sprite. I'll be right back. And we heard a crash, and I ran downstairs. She was lying at the bottom of the stairs. She was incoherent. I called an ambulance. The kids were very good. The older of the two girls has her own cell phone, called her mom, and said, Grandma's acting kind of funny. Peter's going to the hospital with her. She had an uncle who lived across town. Come and pick us up, and that's what happened. Actually, the parents came into town later that night.
Wow.
And she lingered for 10 days, and she died on December 7th of 2010.
Wow. I'm sorry to derail you on all that.
That's all right. One of these days, I must write a book about her, because she's, except for her patients who adored her, she's kind of an unsung heroine and a fantastic personality. But that's another story for another time. Right now we're talking about HEIRESS, Strangled, and Molten Chocolate, a Nazi sex orgy, which I should remind people is available very inexpensively at Amazon.com or at BarnesandNoble.com or at the iTunes store, or you can go to Smashwords.com and download it there.
I'm going to read it. I'm genuinely going to read it. I imagine that it's awesome. But, okay, so we covered two of the things that, like you said, you're a crackerjack writer. You're a jack-of-all-trades writer. You did copywriting. You did a little bit of journalism. And then you became a hired gun author.
Well,
tell me about that.
Okay, I have done 2 books that I'm allowed to talk about. One that's under...
so you're a ghostwriter.
Well,
basically,
the 2 that I'm allowed to talk about have my name on it.
Okay.
One was called Cigars and Other Passions. It was the life of Edgar Cullman. Edgar Cullman came from a well-to-do family and became better to do. He was once the cigar king of America. He owned half the cigar brands in the United States. On the high end, he
Did you ever frequent Tampa Bay? Ybor City? No?
No. Well, no, I think I've been in Tampa a couple of times going over to... Is that where you go to
Huge
Sanibel?
cigar.
Is that where you go over to Sanibel?
Sanibel Island, yeah. Sanibel Island's down there.
I used to vacation now and then at Sanibel years
Well, I was
ago.
just asking because Ybor City is a huge cigar place.
Never checked it out. But Edgar inherited a cigar business from his father, who gained it from his father, and made a lot of money in cigars, eventually sold many, many famous American brands, as I said, from Macanudos on the high end down to Cigarillos and Tijuana Smalls on the low end, sold them to a Swedish conglomerate called Swedish Match Company, and retired with gazillions, real gazillions. And if you want to make money, you don't do it writing. That's the first rule of thumb.
Behind every great fortune, there's a crime, right?
No, there was no crime. What there was a sea race.
A what?
A race, an ocean race. Let me tell you about this. This is a great story. His grandfather, Edgar, died 2 years ago at the age of 93.
Okay.
Edgar's grandfather in the 19th century inherited from his father a cigar rolling business. In those days, it was a job that a lot of immigrants had. You'd buy some tobacco. The whole family would roll cigars. You'd go around. You'd try to find a hotel or a restaurant. You say, I'll sell you these cigars. You can sell them to your customers. I'll put your brand on it. I'll put your name on it. Some were good, some were not so good, depending on the tobacco and how well they were rolled. And their family was in that business. Edgar's grandfather, at the turn of the century, was involved in a sea race against time. William McKinley, before he became president, was a congressman from Ohio and passed an agricultural tariff to protect his corn farmers in Ohio. The cornfields were still there when I was in college. But it was an import tax on all imported agricultural goods, so it wouldn't look like it was just protecting the corn farmers. Unfortunately, for the cigar businesses in America, that included tobacco leaf. And evidently the very best tobacco leaf was not Havana leaf in those days, it was Sumatran leaf. Sumatra.
Yep.
And the people who cultivated Sumatran leaf, Sumatra had been a Dutch colony, were the Dutch. And the tariff was going to be slapped on at a certain date. His grandfather borrowed something like $5 million. And in the book, I do an inflation calculator to figure out what it is today. I forget what it was, but it was something like $175 million, I think, if I remember correctly. And sailed to Europe and literally cornered the Sumatran tobacco leaf market, bought it all up, put it on a boat, and as fast as he could sail to New York, and he was racing the date in which the tariff would go into effect. If he made it, he knew he was going to be rich. If he didn't make it, he would not only be bankrupt, but he would have bankrupted all kinds of friends and family and people from whom he'd borrow money. He made it.
Without risk, there is no reward.
Yeah, and that was the beginning of the Coleman fortune. And Edgar had reached the age of 91. He had had a very interesting life, he thought. He had done some interesting business transactions. He bought and sold the X-Lax Corporation, making something like $300 million in the process, or was it $100 million? I'm bad with remembering numbers, but it's in the book. He had helped publicize some inexpensive cigars like Tijuana Smalls and Cigarillos. He had been a great hospital benefactor to Mount Sinai Hospital, and he was not very well known, and he wanted to leave a legacy for his grandchildren besides money, in addition to money. Mm-hmm. He wanted his biography written. Two people had tried and had not succeeded, I think because they really didn't know how to get into research and spin stories. When you dig into his family's history and his wife's family's history, there were fascinating things, but you had to go digging for them. You couldn't do it just by sticking a microphone in front of him and saying, Edgar, tell me how you got into the cigar business. Well, I went to work for my father. They were delighted with the book, and he held, I think it was a birthday party. He used to hold huge birthday parties for himself every year. Invited 300 of his closest friends, gave them all a copy of the book. You can still buy the book. It's still out there on the internet as either hard copy. I'm not even sure if Cigars and Other Passions is available as an ebook. I know you can buy it hardcover or paperback. And Edgar passed away a couple of years ago.
What year was that when you wrote that book?
Let's see, it was 2009, I believe.
So
and then the following year, or 2000, it started in 2008 and finished in 2009. And the following year, Edgar's son introduced me to a theatrical producer who wanted a book written. And I'd given him a title, which unfortunately he didn't go with. The title was Who Killed Little Orphan Annie and Other Tales from the Battlefields of Broadway. His name is Roger Hess. And the book, unfortunately, he and his son wrote the title, which is No Biz Like It, from gopher to producer in just 57 years. But there's some great stories in that book because Roger, too, had been worked with showbiz people, and he had dealt with the Elvis Presley estate. What a nightmare that was. And you learn a little bit about the Colonel. You know about the Colonel?
No.
The Colonel was one of the people who lived off Elvis, and there were many of them. And the Colonel turns out to be a Dutch immigrant.
So this is like in Elvis's entourage?
Yes.
When he was like going through his phase where he's...
Elvis was already dead, but the entourage was still living off him.
They were?
Yeah.
But while he was alive as well, right? He was there?
Yeah.
This is like, when you're... I'm going to go have my peanut butter and banana sandwich, fried, whatever it was. And this guy would be hanging out with him.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who hung out with him.
The Colonel.
The Colonel was his business manager.
Okay.
And I think skinned him alive financially. The Colonel was a Dutch citizen. He was never a colonel. He had somehow managed to obtain for himself an honorary Kentucky colonelship. I forget what.
How he lived there? Did he live in Kentucky for a little? What the heck do you need, by the way, to be a Kentucky colonel?
I think either a political connection or somebody to pay off. But that was it. He was never a colonel.
Because I know Hunter S. Thompson, he would always talk about, he call people colonel and stuff like that because he was from Kentucky. Yeah. But anyway, not to get off on the story. So this colonel does what?
The colonel is looking for his cut. Everybody's, they want to produce a tribute to Elvis show in Las Vegas. and they have to get permission from the estate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's everybody from Lisa Marie to Elvis's ex-wife, whose name is escaping me. Priscilla Presley.
Priscilla Presley.
Priscilla Presley. The Colonel somehow shows up in Vegas and is looking for a piece of the action, which I don't think he got. I think they made him go away. But the nightmare of dealing with all that is amazing. As I said, theatrical producers have great stories to tell.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah, right.
This is more nonfiction work.
Yeah, that's nonfiction. Most of what I've done...
You've done a lot of nonfiction stuff. You like
only
writing?
recently. Only recently.
Are you into documentaries?
I have never done a documentary film. The most I've
But
done...
are you like? Do you like watching documentaries? Are you?
Oh, yeah. If they're good ones.
I do, too. I'm addicted to them. I've seen everything.
Well, if somebody wants to make a documentary of HEIRESS, Strangled, and Molten Chocolate, which has a lot of true stories in it, you better get on it fast before the last of the people who were there die off. But, there were some editorial people on the Post, and there were some great people at the time. Gail Green, who was the food critic now, was a young feature writer who sometimes sat next to me. And I once noticed that she was typing right-handed, pecking away at the keys right-handed, and her left arm is extended with her wrist hanging loose. I said, Gail, what the hell are you doing? She said, I'm drying my fingernail polish. There were all these great characters on the Post. Pete Hamill was there, although I didn't know Pete. He was on his own. He was a superstar from the moment he set foot in the door, which I was not. Kluger, who was a major scholarly author, was a reporter there. It went on and on and on.
So let's talk about the book. Let's round this out with the book, okay?
Okay.
So this book, you write, and in the description that you have on Amazon, it talks about your parents being batshit crazy.
Oh, were they ever batshit crazy? Let me give you an example. In my freshman year of college, I had been in a college play, and I liked it. The theater bug bit me. I stood on stage. People applauded. I got to be somebody else. There was a job open as an apprentice at something called the Trotwood Circle Theater outside of Dayton, Ohio, for the summer. And I took the job. Antioch arranged it for me, and I was happy as a clam. I was going to paint scenery and hold a spear and have some walk-ons on stage and learn a little bit about stagecraft. I figured this would all come in handy at some point. My parents both hit the ceiling. Absolutely. My father said to me, if you take that job, you're out of the house. I'm never speaking to you again, and you can put yourself through college. I was 17 years old. There was no way I was going to do it. Even then, you couldn't put yourself through college, that kind of college, washing dishes. And my mother was equally adamant about it. What was the problem? My father heard that everybody in the theater was homosexual and figured that if I got a job painting scenery in Ohio, I would turn gay. Although the word gay didn't exist. My mother had the opposite theory, which was that she must have gotten this out of some book she read, that I was going to fall into the clutches of an older woman who would take me into her bed. Had that happened, I would have said, thank you, God.
I know. From our conversation, I know
like
you
that
would be.
idea. But at any rate, they absolutely refused, and they contacted the college and said, you can't do this. The college said, well, we can't place him anymore. My father, through his connections, got me a job in Macy's basement, where my title was salesgirl. In those days, girl was part of a title.
What?
Yes. Yeah, there were women. I discussed this in the book. A woman in the 1950s, and remember I was in college in the 50s, this is even before the 60s. A woman was somebody old enough to be your mother. But anybody who was attractive and sexy was a girl, and would probably have been a little, if not insulted, would have looked at you a little funny if you called her a woman. What is this? That all changed around 1970, but until then, they were girls. And
so your title was salesgirl?
I don't think I had a title, but that was sales. And there was a training class.
It's pretty ironic where he's concerned about homosexual.
Yeah.
And then
wait a second. I discussed this in the book too. I got put in Macy's basement. The first half of the summer, I was selling charcoal grills and things. The second half, those were no longer in season because the people were going to buy the barbecue had bought already. So they started putting out things like ashtrays and decorative glassware and silent butlers. And I was getting the training that would have enabled me to own a gift shop in some gay town like Provincetown, Massachusetts, selling on the. It was just the opposite. But this is the way it was. My mother was constantly afraid that I was going to somehow embarrass her.
What was the background? What's your background?
On both sides, we are Ashkenazic Jews. They're all from
German Jew.
No.
Isn't Ashkenazi? No.
Well, it's Eastern European. It goes from Germany into Russia, into Romania, into Poland. And my whole family on both sides were from Minsk.
Were some people in the concentration camps or anything like that? Grandparents?
Not
or anything?
anybody
No?
that I would have known. There may have been relatives left behind, but they had been forgotten by
Who came over here to
my
U.S.?
grandparents. Actually, my father was 5 months old at the time he was brought over, but it was essentially the grandparents on both sides. And I discussed them, too.
Were they batshit crazy?
No, they were desperately poor on my father's side, desperately hungry. My mother's side, her father was a small entrepreneur. He had good years and bad years. When he had bad years, my mother used to say the family starved, which didn't really mean they starved. What it meant was that they did without a lot of stuff. And in good years, he would take off for the Catskills in a chauffeur-driven Oldsmobile with his mistress, leaving the family behind. And they were always very self-conscious about being foreigners, about being greenhorns, which may account for the fact that my mother put on a false front one morning and never took it off again for the rest of her life. I'll give you an example. My first apartment while I was working for the Post was a tiny little charming one-room apartment in a townhouse in Greenwich Village. A studio, tiny studio, with a garden out back. My mother came and cried, "How could you live in a dump like this tiny little thing, and you're paying $104 a month for it?" And I get out of college, and my first apartment, I figured I'd better get a bigger apartment so my mother won't cry. And I got a walk-up in a tenement on the Upper East Side. How could you live in a walk-up apartment? It's filthy, it's disgusting. Then I lived in this huge studio apartment on the 16th, 17th floor on East 15th Street and 3rd Avenue, brand new building. She wept bitter tears. You know, I grew up only 4 blocks from here on the Lower East Side, and you've moved back to the neighborhood. It's an embarrassment. P.S. Toward the end of her life, when I moved in from the suburbs, I bought an apartment on Park Avenue. Very fancy address. It was on Park Avenue and 93rd Street. My mother came up. By then my father had died. My mother came up and wept bitter tears. How can I tell anybody my children live above 86th Street? As I said, she was crazy. And you could never do anything right. I mean,
you couldn't do anything right.
Nothing, not a thing.
That's funny. No. Forever. Yeah, she was always like that.
She was always like that.
How peculiar. Interesting.
Well, that's what I mean by batshit crazy. I don't think she was paranoid schizophrenic.
No.
But she was living in her own make-believe world, and heaven help you if you tried to point out that this wasn't the real world. I mean, she would go nuts and cry and weep.
Was she like an overbearing mother? Would you consider?
No. Her thing was don't stand out, which is probably why I was attracted by things like writing in the theater. Don't stand out. Don't let anybody notice you. Be very quiet, dress nice, don't show off, don't do anything that'll embarrass the family.
That's funny. It's like the opposite with me, you know? Like anything that you could do to draw attention to yourself, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, the world has changed. But again, what they were trying to do was, particularly my mother, was not have anybody notice that they were the children of foreigners and the children of immigrants.
Right, they're assimilating into United States.
They're trying to assimilate. And
that's how a lot of them were, right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
On the Italian side, I have Italian immigrant grandparents and whatnot, and they stopped teaching their kids Italian and things like that. Everybody assimilated. Kind of the same deal. Just try to camouflage into everything and stuff, stay in the background. I get that. That's from that generation.
Yeah. In fact, my parents would speak Yiddish to each other occasionally, but only when they didn't want the children to understand. So
same thing with Italian.
So I always associated Yiddish with secrets.
Right.
And they once, in the middle of a Yiddish conversation, used an English word cancer, and I thought cancer was a Yiddish word.
Wow. So Judaism, are you religious?
No. I freely acknowledge my Jewishness. I am culturally Jewish. Look at me, you know I'm Jewish, but I'm not at all religious.
No?
No.
So do you believe in God?
That's an interesting question. I sometimes describe myself as a lapsed atheist because they used to have a saying in the Army, there are no atheists in foxholes. When you get really scared or really helpless, you end up praying.
Did you ever find yourself in that kind of situation?
I'll tell you a better story. Roberta, my girlfriend who died,
right.
I had kidney cancer, which is usually fatal. This is more than 8 years ago, and they caught it in time. They got it out of me, so I was sad. But she was really scared for me. I didn't know enough to be scared. And evidently, when I went into the hospital for surgery, she was a militant atheist. She would say things like the worst crimes in history have been committed
By religion.
By religion, and any religion.
Absolutely.
On her way from New York Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical Center, to her office on Park Avenue, she passed a Roman Catholic church. She stopped in it, she prayed, and put $20 in the collection box.
Was she Catholic?
No, she was Jewish.
What the fuck?
This is a true story. Well, she was also very...
All the people that you surround yourself with are very unconventional and interesting, right?
I
a
think,
large majority, and you yourself as well, and that's great.
Well, thank you for thinking so, I guess. I never considered myself unconventional. I've always thought of myself as kind of a square, but...
Really? You're not at all.
Well, thank you.
It's awesome. This is a very, very interesting conversation. Crazy life, you know?
Yeah.
Full, rich life.
Well, full and rich, and you know the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Perhaps my life has been a little too interesting, but here I am, a lot closer to the end of it than the beginning. And I've come full circle from the studio apartment to the bigger studio apartment to the one-bedroom apartment to the little house in Port Washington, the big house in Port Washington, to a Park Avenue apartment, to Roberta's Park Avenue apartment. After she died, I had to move out fast. Business is slowing down, and I ended up right back where I started from in another studio. So I'm making the full circle. It's a little bit ominous.
Do you like apartment living, apartment life?
I do. I would prefer to have a little more space. On the other hand, I'm alone now, and it's nice to have only one room to take care of, and it's certainly cheap.
Are you a social person?
I try to be, but, you know, at my age, most people are married, and they don't like single people. It's kind of a third wheel. And a lot of the people who aren't married, I'm not so comfortable with.
Yeah. And now you find yourself doing what now? You've written a book.
I still ghost write books and will fight crazy for an assignment to get one. And I get paid by the hour. The person who's the subject of the book or who commissions the book owns the copyright. So, you know, all I do.
And then your name doesn't go on that.
Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
A lot of people get stuff ghostwritten, right?
Well, not a lot, and a lot of them are looking for the next Henry Steele Commager. They really want a name brand author, but there are people, and I love to get those. I love to do those. I write for a couple of business publications. I still get advertising assignments. If you go to my business website, which is peterhochstein.com.
Hochstein spelled Hochstein, correct?
That is correct, Bobby. If you go to peterhochstein.com, you can see samples of the books I've written on commission. There are others out there, out of print, but still available secondhand on the internet. I did one called Up From Seltzer, A Handy Guide to 4 Jewish Generations. I've done a couple of other things I prefer not to speak about. And, of course, I've done HEIRESS, STRANGLED, and MOLTEN Chocolate at Nazi Sex Orgy. But that was, I wrote for me. That will not appear on my business website. That's a separate project.
That's a separate thing on Amazon.
Yeah, on Amazon. You can even dip in and read, I think, about 10 or 15 pages on Amazon. And for all I know, you can do it on some other sites, too.
What do you think about, like, the self-publishing, you know, how everything's going basically with the internet?
It scares the hell out of me.
Like we were talking earlier before we started the podcast, I mean, anybody can do anything now with the internet. It's amazing. If you have the wherewithal, if you have the experience, the equipment, whatever, you can self-publish, you create podcasts, you basically broadcast yourself, your own radio shows. There's so many things that are becoming like kind of do-it-yourself kind of deal. But it's all about the marketing with self-publishing, right?
Exactly. And those friends of mine who say they're doing well on the internet are people who came to the internet with a following, like my friend Lawrence Block, the mystery author. Larry, over the course of his lifetime, and I met him in college, has written maybe, I'm guessing, 150 to 250 books, mostly mystery novels, although some other things as well, some sex novels, some how-to books on writing. One is called Telling Lies for Fun and Profit. I love that. And because he has a following, which he has cultivated assiduously over the past 40 or 50 years, it's very easy via his email list and via his blog and via his Twitter account, which he has lots of followers on, to say, hey, I've got this new book out, go to Amazon and get it. And
what about you with social media? Are you connected like that?
Unfortunately, I'm a bit of a relic. My book has a blog of its own, but I don't know that anybody visits it. And to tell you the truth, I don't put much into it.
What about Facebook? Do you do that?
I'm scared of Facebook.
Twitter?
I don't have a Twitter account.
Do you let your friend tweet it out for you sometimes? Will he ever do that for you?
I will have to ask him. That's an excellent idea, Bobby. And
let's ask him once we do the podcast here, okay? And we have it all in the can.
Yeah,
do you think that he would tweet it out?
I think he's mostly, and I can't blame him, he makes his living entirely from his mystery novels. And in fact, one is being shot in New York right now. It's called A Trip to the Boneyard, and I think it'll be out next.
It's being shot?
Yeah, in New York.
It's becoming a movie?
A movie, yeah.
Nice.
He wrote the book maybe 20, 25 years ago. That's what happens. You make money when you don't expect to make money. You don't make money when you do expect to make money. It's one of those things. You got to be accustomed to living on the edge, which I hate. One of the reasons I stayed in advertising, which was sometimes wonderful and sometimes miserable to me, is I knew twice a month I was getting a paycheck. And I knew I'd be able to pay them more.
They pay you good in advertising, right? They pay you very well.
They used to. I'm not sure it's as good as it used to be. But we used to be paid quite nicely, not as well as an investment banker. There were no hedge funds in those days, but not as well as an investment banker or a Big Ten law firm guy would do after 3 years.
God, I envy you. I really do.
But well enough.
But I envy you, man, because that was one of the things I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to experience it and become a copywriter, but it's just so hard to break yourself into it. You don't have any hookups still, do you? Being done in 95?
If I did, I'd use them. I mean, what the gag, and it's not a gag really, but the line I use is that everybody who used to throw work my way is either dead or selling real estate. Yeah, I have one client who has a one-woman virtual agency out in California and who uses me to write direct response television commercials. You know.
Wow. What about Billy Mays? Did you ever do anything for him? Or?
No. For an
He's
agency,
from Tampa, Florida.
I work for an agency out on the West Coast called The Response Shop. I've been working with the proprietor, who's a woman named Marla Hoskins. Been working with Marla on and off now for about 10 years. 2 or 3 times she'll call me and I'll do a television project for her, and then I won't hear from her again for 2 or 3 months. But that's the way it works. I have one friend at one agency. He's an associate creative director. He was a trainee of mine, actually at the same agency. Both of us left it. He came back some years later.
Not Ogilvy, right?
No. This was a direct response agency called Rapp Collins. He called me this time last year, and I worked for him for a few weeks. But I haven't really been, other than I haven't set foot in an ad agency in about 8 years.
Right.
Most of what I do, I maintain a little office. I keep my overhead low. It's cheap, but I couldn't work at home when I was living with Roberta and when she was alive. And now I'm in such a small space that if I spend 24 hours a day there, I would go batshit crazy.
And on that note, we've learned a lot today, right? I feel like we've learned a lot about you, Peter. You're a very interesting person. I had a great time discussing all these things that you've done in your life, from yellow journalism, learning all these different things in the heyday of the Mad Men era. It's really awesome.
Well, thank you. Bobby, it's been a pleasure talking to you. If I may mention one more time that HEIRESS, STRANGLED, and Molten Chocolate at Nazi Sex Orgy is available as an ebook download from Amazon.com or the iTunes Store or BarnesandNoble.com or Smashwords. Go get it. It's only $3.99. You know, less than the price of a pair of socks. And I think you'll have a pretty good time reading.
And let me just say, too, that conducting this podcast here at the Shelburne Hotel in the lobby was really awesome. This is a nice little quaint area, isn't it?
I like this. And as I said, I have some nice memories associated with being down here in the course of my short-lived but wonderful newspaper career. And now I live only 2 blocks away, and it's kind of fun to pass by every day and say, hey, I remember when this was big stuff here.
Yeah. Well, Peter Hochstein.
Correct.
Thank you so much for being on my show. I really appreciate it.
Bobby Pickles, thank you.
For the Bobby Pickles podcast from the Shelburne Hotel in the Murray Hill section of Manhattan, I'm Bobby Pickles.
1, 2, 3. FatEnzo.com. 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 Enzo.com vet. Enzo.com vet. Enzo.com vet. Enzo.com